In the middle of a luxury dinner at the mansion, tragedy struck. The millionaire's young son choked on a grapeseed and fell to the floor, struggling to breathe. All the rich guests, the city's elite, just froze, paralyzed by panic. The desperate father shouted, accusing the nearby cleaning lady. "What did you give him?" But the truth was something much worse. Ignoring the accusation, the woman acted. The father ran towards her, thinking she was harming his son, and fell to his knees, expecting the worst, only to see the seed fly out of the boy's mouth, who took a deep breath with a loud, healthy cry. The father's relief, however, was short-lived, for what the cleaning lady said next revealed the true horror of that night. The glare from the crystal chandeliers was blinding, casting dancing prisms across the marble walls and the faces of the most influential guests in the country. In Arthur Montenegro's mansion, the air was thick with the scent of fresh lilies and the murmur of conversations about fortunes and power. Men in bespoke suits and women draped in jewels worth more than small islands spoke of the latest moves on the stock market, the rise and fall of stocks, and the volatility of crypto. To any observer, it was the pinnacle of success, a celebration of wealth and capital accumulated over generations, or, in Arthur's case, over a decade of brilliant investments that had made him a billionaire before 40. But for Arthur, the night's host, the party was a silent torture. His gaze didn't linger on the polished smiles or the calculated gestures of his guests. It followed with an almost feverish devotion. The small figure of his 5-year-old son, Leo. Leo was the center of his universe, the only inheritance of incalculable value left by his late wife, Helena. Every laugh from the boy was a melody that soothed Arthur's soul. Every small scrape on his knee, a wound in his own heart. The boy was playing near the immense dining table, under the ostensible watch of Veronica, the nanny. She seemed attentive, but Arthur knew the fragility of the world. He had built an empire, a net worth that many national treasuries would envy, but he knew all his money couldn't buy back a single second of lost time or reverse a single tragedy. One of the guests, a tech mogul, approached him with a glass of champagne. "Arthur, my friend, your latest play in renewable energy funds was a masterstroke. The returns will be astronomical." Arthur forced a smile, nodding, but his eyes had already darted back to Leo. He saw the boy's gaze shift from the nanny for just an instant, drawn to the gleam of purple grapes in a silver fruit bowl. An icy sensation shot down Arthur's spine. It was an irrational fear, the same one that haunted him every night. The awareness that the most precious thing in his life was also the most fragile. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a woman in a uniform, the new cleaner, discreetly wiping a spot on the floor near the table where a careless guest had dropped a glass. She was practically invisible amid so much luxury, a shadow in the splendor. For a second, Arthur was distracted by the mogul's insistent comment about dividends and cash flow. It was only a second, a blink of an eye in the grand scheme of time, but it was enough. When his gaze returned, he saw Leo's small hand pick up a single grape. The boy, with the innocence of his age, put it in his mouth. Time, which had been flowing in a continuous stream of anxiety, suddenly shattered into a million frozen fragments. Leo's smile vanished, replaced by a look of confusion, then panic. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes, so full of life moments before, began to widen in silent terror. A dry, useless cough was the only sound that broke the party's murmur, a silent alarm that no one but Arthur seemed to hear. The boy's face began to take on a terrifying bluish hue, and Arthur's world collapsed. The silence that followed was more deafening than any explosion. The incessant chatter about deals and investments died on the guests' lips. Champagne flutes stopped halfway to their mouths. Smiles froze, turning into masks of shock and horror. The country's financial elite, Men and women who moved the world's capital with a single phone call were utterly paralyzed. They were masters of the abstract universe of numbers, of stock charts that rose and fell, of the profitability of offshore accounts, but faced with the raw, terrible reality of a life slipping away, they were useless. Time, for Arthur, became a viscous, slow-moving enemy. Every second was an eternity of agony, watching his son's life, his one true fortune, escape through his fingers. Panic rose in his throat like bitter bile, burning him, choking him as much as the grape was choking his boy. Veronica, the nanny, finally reacted, but in the worst possible way. A sharp, hysterical scream tore through the air, a sound devoid of any utility, a pure manifestation of dread. She gesticulated wildly, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on Leo, but without taking a single step to help. She was the personification of helplessness, a passive witness to the tragedy she was supposed to prevent. Arthur's mind, normally an instrument of logical precision, capable of calculating risks and predicting market trends, went into total meltdown. Despair sought a target, an anchor for its overwhelming pain, and it found one. His bloodshot eyes locked onto the discreet figure of the cleaner, Lucia. She was still nearby, a dustpan in one hand and a brush in the other, the shards of the broken glass already collected. In Arthur's distorted mind, her proximity was proof of guilt. She was the foreign element, the piece that didn't fit in his world of wealth and control, pain twisted into a blind accusation. "What did you do?" he screamed, his voice raw with anguish. "What did you do to my son?" The accusation hung in the air, laden with venom and despair. All eyes turned to Lucia, the invisible woman who had suddenly become the center of attention. For an instant, she looked confused, her face marked by surprise and the sting of injustice. But then, something in her eyes shifted. The confusion gave way to a clarity and determination that stunned everyone. She dropped the dustpan and brush, which clattered on the marble floor, and completely ignored the billionaire accusing her. Her movements, once discreet and contained, became swift and precise. She didn't run, but moved with a focused urgency, crossing the small space that separated her from Leo. Arthur watched, his heart hammering against his ribs, a new wave of terror washing over him. What was this woman going to do? In his fevered mind, he imagined the worst. The scene that unfolded next made him drop to his knees, a groan of pure defeat escaping his lips. He saw her grab his son from behind, wrapping her arms around the small body with a strength that seemed impossible for her frame. He saw her hands locked together over the boy's abdomen and Dace with a sudden movement that looked brutally violent. She applied intense pressure inward and upward. Arthur's world shrank to that one gesture, which he interpreted as the final blow. Kneeling on the cold marble floor, he squeezed his eyes shut, unable to witness what his terrified mind believed was the consummation of the tragedy. His entire empire, his assets, his holdings and liabilities, the return on his financial investments, the fortune that allowed him to bend reality to his will, it all turned to dust before the image of his son dying in a stranger's arms. He braced for the final silence, for the scream that would confirm his irreparable loss. But what came next was not the silence of death. It was a sound, a small pop, almost imperceptible, but it echoed in the opulent room with the force of a thunderclap. Arthur's eyes flew open just as a tiny, dark projectile shot from Leo's mouth, arcing through the air and landing with a delicate click on the polished floor. It was the grape. Immediately after, another sound came, the most beautiful Arthur had ever heard in his life, a deep, ragged gasp of air, a desperate breath that filled Leo's small lungs. That breath was followed by a violent, convulsive cough that expelled the rest of the tears and fear, and then the crying, a loud, strong wail, full of life and childish indignation. The blue tint on the boy's face receded, replaced by a healthy red. The tears streaming down his cheeks were the most concrete proof of life. The maneuver, which Arthur had seen as an act of violence, had been an act of salvation, executed with surgical precision. The Heimlich maneuver, the wave of relief that hit Arthur, was so overwhelming it left him weak. His body, once tensed like a steel cable, went limp, and he remained there, on his knees, trembling uncontrollably as tears, once of terror, now flowed freely, a torrent of gratitude and shame. The guests' paralysis broke in a collective murmur of astonishment and relief. Lucia, however, seemed oblivious to the drama surrounding her. With stunning composure, she turned Leo to face her, kneeling to be at his eye level. Her hands, firm and gentle, stroked the boy's back as her voice, low and soft, whispered words of comfort that Arthur couldn't hear. Leo, still sobbing, clung to her, burying his face in her shoulder as if she were the safe harbor he had known forever. And it was in that moment, watching his son being comforted by the woman he had so vilely accused, that the magnitude of his error hit him like a physical blow. He, the multi-billionaire Arthur Montenegro, who prided himself on his judgment and his ability to read people, had acted like a fool blinded by grief. Slowly raising his gaze, he met Lucia's eyes over Leo's shoulder. There was no accusation in them, no triumph, no anger. There was only a deep calm, a kind of weariness, and a silent dignity that completely disarmed him. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with unasked questions. All eyes were fixed on the scene, the boy in the cleaner's arms and the billionaire father humbled on his knees on the floor. Arthur pushed himself off the floor, his knees aching. The expensive fabric of his trousers creased. His movements were slow, hesitant, like an old man just woken from a nightmare. For an instant, the world around him seemed distorted, the faces of his guests floating in his peripheral vision. Their expressions a mixture of shock, pity, and a morbid curiosity that disgusted him. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way no downturn in the stock market had ever made him feel. His entire fortune, his vast holdings in real estate, stocks, and even speculative crypto felt like cardboard armor, useless in protecting his heart from the terror that had consumed him. He walked the few steps that separated him from Lucia and Leo. The woman was still on her knees, holding his son with a serenity that was a stark counterpoint to the chaos in his own soul. Leo, his face streaked with tears, looked up at his father over Lucia's shoulder, his sobs beginning to subside. With a gentleness Arthur hadn't expected, Lucia helped Leo turn and guided him into his father's arms. The moment Arthur held him, a tremor ran through his body. He hugged the boy tightly, inhaling the scent of his hair, feeling the warmth of his small body against his chest. This was the only real thing, the only asset that mattered in his life. He murmured his son's name repeatedly, like a mantra, his voice thick with emotion. For a long moment, father and son remained embraced, a refuge in the middle of the silent storm that had settled over the ballroom. Arthur raised his gaze and met Lucia's eyes again. He opened his mouth to speak, to try to articulate the immensity of his gratitude and the depth of his shame, but the words wouldn't come. What could one say to someone who had saved their universe? A thank you felt like an insult, a triviality in the face of what she had done. He just nodded, a small, clumsy gesture, but one that carried the full weight of his emotion. Lucia returned the nod, rising with quiet dignity and taking a step back, as if wanting to become invisible again. But it was too late. She was now the center of this story. And as Arthur's relief began to give way to reason, a cold, sharp question began to form in his mind. The adrenaline subsided, and clarity brought with it an icy rage. His gaze swept the room, past the woman who had saved his son, and landed like a guided missile on the trembling figure of Veronica, The nanny was huddled near a marble column, her face as pale as wax, her eyes wide with panic. She wasn't looking at Leo or Arthur, but at the floor, as if wishing it would open up and swallow her. Her scream still echoed in Arthur's mind, a useless scream, a sound of pure terror when action was needed. She was there. The Guardian paid a king's ransom whose sole job was to ensure his son's safety, and she had failed spectacularly. Arthur's misdirected anger found its true target. With Leo still secure in his arms, he turned fully to Veronica, his posture radiating a cold authority that caused the murmurs to cease instantly. His voice, when he spoke, was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the air like a scalpel. "You were right next to him." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "I saw you. Where were you when my son needed you?" "Veronica?" Arthur's question, though spoken quietly, ricocheted through the silent room. Every guest, every titan of industry and master of finance became a statue, part of an impromptu tribunal. Veronica, the target of that glacial inquiry, visibly shrank. The blood drained from her face, leaving her deathly pale. She opened her mouth, but only a choked sound escaped. Her eyes darted back and forth, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. She was a cornered animal, and the predator was a father whose fury was as vast as his fortune. I was here," she stammered, her voice a trembling thread. "I was watching, I swear. It all happened so fast, I didn't see." "You didn't see." Arthur's voice remained dangerously calm, but there was an undercurrent of rage that made even the most powerful men in the room uneasy. "You were less than 5 feet from him. Your only job, the only reason you are paid an annual salary that many would consider a small fortune, is to see, and in the one moment it mattered, you didn't see." He took a step forward, and Veronica flinched back, her back hitting the marble column. The fear in her eyes was palpable. She tried to defend herself again. There was a noise, a glass breaking. I looked for a second, just 1 second. The lie was weak, desperate, and Arthur shattered it with a look. He knew, with the sharp intuition that had made him a multi-billionaire, that there was more. He hadn't built his empire by accepting flimsy excuses. He demanded results, accountability, from his executives managing multi-million-dollar assets and from the woman who looked after his only child. "Don't lie to me, Veronica," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more lethal. "Not here, not now. The truth, the pressure of the silence, the weight of dozens of judgmental eyes, and above all, the relentless intensity of Arthur's gaze were too much for her." The floodgates broke. Veronica collapsed into tears, racking sobs shaking her body. "It was my phone," she confessed between sobs, her voice muffled by the hands covering her face. "It buzzed. A text. It was important. Personal. I just glanced down for an instant. I didn't think it would hurt anything. It was only for a second." The confession hung in the air, ugly and pathetic. A moment of trivial distraction, a personal text message, weighed against the life of a child. The disdain in the room was almost a physical force. Arthur didn't shout. His anger was cold and final. He turned to his head of security, who had materialized silently at his side. "Escort Ms. Veronica out. Gather her belongings. She no longer works for me." The sentence was delivered without emotion, as if he were liquidating an underperforming stock. Veronica looked at him, her face a mask of shock and despair, but Arthur no longer saw her. His world had reconfigured itself. He had dealt with the failure. Now he had to face his salvation. Slowly he turned, and his eyes met Lucia's, who had watched everything in silence from a corner. The humiliation of the false accusations still hung between them, a debt no amount of money could ever repay. The entire room held its breath, waiting to see what the billionaire would do next. "Ma'am," he began, his voice hoarse, laden with a weight that went beyond words. "Please, don't go anywhere. I need to speak with you." Arthur's request, laden with a desperate urgency, hung in the air, solidifying the tension in the room. Lucia, who had instinctively started to back away, to retreat into the shadows from which she'd come, stopped. She looked at the man before her, not as a billionaire, a mogul whose investment decisions could shake markets, but as a father who, moments ago, had been on his knees, broken by the prospect of loss. She saw the tremor in his hands as he held his son, the way his face, normally a mask of control and authority, was now raw, etched with agony and a profound shame. She didn't feel anger over the accusation. In the chaos of panic, she had seen only fear, not malice. In her heart, there was no room for resentment, only a quiet empathy for the terror he had faced. She gave a slight nod, a silent consent that sealed her fate for the night. Arthur then realized the absurdity of the situation. He was standing in the middle of his ballroom, his son in his arms, an unlikely heroine at his side, and an audience of dozens of the country's wealthiest people watching his every move. The gala had devolved into a private, humiliating theater. He needed to regain control, not for pride's sake, but to create a safe space where he could begin to repair the damage he had caused. With Leo nestled on his shoulder, he turned to his guests. His voice, when he spoke, was firm, but the rasp of recent emotion was still there. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the abrupt end to the evening. Thank you all for coming, but as you can see, I need to give my full attention to my family." It was a polite but undeniable dismissal. No one protested. In fact, most seemed relieved to be released from the charged atmosphere. A hasty and strangely silent withdrawal began. The murmurs were hushed, exchanged behind gloved hands and fans. Men who had earlier spoken loudly about the price of gold and the future of Bitcoin now tiptoed out, avoiding their host's gaze. The superficiality of this world had never been clearer to Arthur. Faced with a real crisis, all the talk of net worth, of profits and dividends, was just noise. Within minutes, the grand ballroom was empty. The echo of hurried footsteps faded, replaced by a profound silence, broken only by the soft breathing of Leo, who was falling asleep in his father's arms. The staff of waiters and cooks, instructed by a gesture from the head of security, had also discreetly withdrawn. Only the three of them remained, Arthur, Leo, and Lucia, amid the wreckage of a party that never finished. Arthur walked to one of the velvet sofas and sat, settling Leo carefully. He looked at Lucia, who remained standing, her hands clasped in front of her, a posture of someone who did not belong. "Please, sit," he said, his voice softer now. I don't know where to begin." He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of exhaustion. "What can I do? Tell me. A check. Name your price. Whatever you want. I owe you a debt that no money can repay, but it's the only language I know to begin expressing my thanks." He looked at her expectantly, hoping the mention of his vast fortune could somehow begin to bridge the chasm between them. Lucia regarded him for a long moment, her face serene and unreadable. She looked neither impressed nor offended by the offer. She simply assessed him. And then, in a calm voice that cut through the mansion's oppressive silence, she answered, "A life has no price, Mr. Montenegro." Lucia's answer, "A life has no price, Mr. Montenegro," landed in the mansion's silence like a stone in a still lake, sending out shockwaves that rocked the foundations of Arthur's world. He was used to negotiating, to quantifying, to turning everything into numbers that could be entered on a spreadsheet. Love, loyalty, time, everything in his universe had a monetary equivalent. He bought the best toys, the best education, the best security. His cash flow was robust enough to solve any problem, but this woman's simple, unshakable statement dismantled his entire philosophy. She wasn't negotiating for a higher figure. She was operating in a completely different reality, one where human value transcended any financial asset. The shame he felt deepened. He hadn't just accused an innocent woman, he had tried to pay for a miracle as if it were a common business transaction. "I know that," he said, his voice low and strained. "Please, understand. This isn't about putting a price on my son's life. It's about my debt to you. I need to do something. To let you walk away tonight with nothing would be unthinkable. It would be a failure of character I couldn't bear. My entire legacy would mean nothing if I didn't honor the woman who saved my heir." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, a pleading gesture he had never made to anyone in his adult life. "How did you know what to do? Everyone else. They froze. People who manage billion-dollar hedge funds, who make high-stakes decisions every day, and they just stood there. But you didn't hesitate. It was like you knew exactly what to do." Lucia watched the man before her. The billionaire's arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a raw vulnerability. She saw the confusion in his eyes, the genuine need to understand, not just to pay. She sighed softly, a tired resignation in her gaze. She had come to this job seeking anonymity, a simple way to make a living and keep busy after years of dedicating herself exclusively to her parents. To reveal her past was to open old wounds, to invite questions she preferred to leave unanswered. But looking at little Leo, sleeping peacefully in his father's lap, she felt she owed them the truth. It was the only currency of value she possessed at that moment. "I'm not just a cleaner, Mr. Montenegro," she said, her voice steady but without a trace of pride. The sentence hung between them, heavy with meaning. Arthur frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" She looked at him directly, and for the first time, Arthur saw beyond the fatigue and quiet dignity. He saw the shadow of another woman, one forged in crisis and accustomed to making life-or-death decisions in seconds. "For 15 years of my life, I was a paramedic. I worked in ambulances, in emergency rooms. Situations like Leo's, I've seen them before, many times." The revelation hit him with the force of a gut punch. A paramedic. The word echoed in his mind, rearranging the entire scene. The calm under pressure, the swift assessment, the precise force, the way she had comforted Leo afterward. It wasn't a lucky instinct. It was training. It was experience. It was professionalism of the highest caliber. The woman he had screamed at, whom he had accused in his despair, was not just the bravest person in the room, she was, by far, the most competent. The irony was crushing, almost cruel. He surrounded himself with the elite, paid fortunes for supposed experts, but in the moment of truth, salvation had come from the most unlikely and overlooked source. The shame he felt morphed into an overwhelming admiration. He looked down at her hands, now resting in her lap, hands that had cleaned his floors, but that also knew how to bring a child back from the brink of silence. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize again, to offer something more, something worthy, but the words seemed to be stuck. All he could manage to say, with a reverence that surprised him, was her name, Lucia. Her name, spoken aloud by him, seemed to change the very atmosphere of the room. Lucia. It was no longer the name of an anonymous employee, but that of a savior. Arthur looked at her, truly saw her for the first time, and felt like a fool. He, a man who prided himself on his perception, on his ability to assess the value of companies and people with a single glance, had made the grossest error in judgment of his life. He saw now the strength in her posture, the intelligence in her calm eyes, the competence etched into her hands. All his capital, his thriving businesses, the empire he built from scratch, suddenly seemed flimsy and superficial compared to the intrinsic worth of the woman before him. He stood, needing to move, and began to pace, his mind racing. "A paramedic," he repeated, the word sounding inadequate in his mouth. I apologize, not just for the accusation. That was unforgivable. Born of my panic, I apologize for my blindness, for looking at you and seeing only a uniform, not the person inside it. I live in a world where everything and everyone has a price tag, and tonight, you showed me just how poor that worldview really is. He stopped in front of her, the anguish on his face genuine. But that only makes it more confusing for me. With that skill, that experience, why a job like this? Please, don't misunderstand. There's no dishonor in any honest work, but you could be saving lives every day. Lucia looked down for a moment, tracing an invisible pattern on the Persian rug. Arthur's question wasn't hostile, but it was invasive, touching a part of her life she had kept locked away. Yet, there was a sincerity in his confusion that compelled her to answer. I couldn't anymore, she said, her voice soft but firm. My mother got sick, Alzheimer's. It was fast and cruel. My father, already elderly, tried to care for her alone, but his heart couldn't take the strain. Suddenly, I had two parents who needed full-time care. The healthcare system is expensive, and caregivers, they aren't always reliable. She paused, the memory of that difficult time bringing a shadow of pain to her eyes. My job demanded 12, sometimes 24-hour shifts. I couldn't be in two places at once, so I made a choice. I chose my family. I sold my small condo to cover the expenses and moved back into their house. It was 5 years. I was their nurse, their cook, their companion. I don't regret a single day. Arthur listened, captivated. He, who paid teams of people to manage every aspect of his life and business, stood before a woman who had sacrificed her career, her financial independence, everything, for love and duty. Her story was a mirror reflecting his own life, showing him the poverty of his connections despite all his wealth. And after, he asked gently, they passed away a little over 6 months ago, Lucia replied, a quiet acceptance in her voice, one after the other. And when it was all over, I had nothing left, no career to go back to, my savings gone. I needed a fresh start, something simple, a job that would let me keep my head busy without having to carry the weight of another person's life in my hands again. Cleaning, it's honest, it's quiet. Arthur stopped pacing. An idea, audacious and clear, began to form in his mind. This wasn't about money. It was about restoring dignity, about honoring sacrifice. It was about putting the right person in the right place. He looked at Leo, sleeping in his lap, the embodiment of everything that mattered. Then he looked at Lucia, the woman who had saved him. Ms. Lucia, he said, his voice charged with a new conviction. I made a terrible mistake tonight, but maybe it was the mistake that will save my life, and not just my son's. I'm not going to insult you with a reward. I'd like to make you a proposition. Lucia looked at the man, whose fortune was a constant whisper in financial circles, and saw the proposition in his eyes before he even voiced it. It wasn't an offer of money. Not anymore. It was a plea. Arthur adjusted his sleeping son in his lap and leaned forward slightly, the intensity in his voice creating a bubble of intimacy in the vast hall. I don't want you to be a cleaner in this house. I don't want you to be a nanny. What I'm offering is a position, one that you, and perhaps only you in the world, are qualified to fill. He paused, gathering the thoughts racing through his mind, the idea solidifying into words. I want to create a role for you, Director of Leo's well-being and security. Your responsibilities would be to ensure he is safe at all times, to assess risks, train the staff, oversee his health, to be the first responder in any emergency. It would be a position of absolute trust, he pressed on, the urgency growing. The salary would be commensurate with that of a senior executive in my companies. Your qualifications are rare and, to me, invaluable. I consider this the most important investment of my life. more crucial than any stock on the market or any interest rate negotiation. It is an investment in my peace of mind and in the future of my only truly irreplaceable asset. The offer was staggering. It wasn't just the financial aspect, which alone would be life-changing, but the weight of the responsibility. It was exactly what she had tried to leave behind, the burden of holding a life in her hands, the exhaustion from her years as a paramedic and then as a caregiver weighed on her soul. She had come here for silence, for simple tasks that asked nothing of her heart. "Mr. Montenegro," she began, her voice low, choosing her words carefully. "I am deeply honored by your trust, but I can't accept. I chose a simpler life for a reason, the weight you're offering me. I've carried it for too many years. I don't have the strength for it anymore." Her refusal was polite but firm. Arthur felt a pang of panic. He hadn't considered she would say no. In his world, offers like this weren't refused. "Please, reconsider," he urged, his voice losing some of its composure. "It wouldn't be like before. Not the chaos of an ER. It would be about prevention, about creating an environment so safe that your emergency skills, hopefully, are never needed again. You told me you sacrificed your career for your family. I'm asking you to use your skills to protect mine." His appeal was powerful, weaving her own story into his argument. Lucia felt her defenses waver. She glanced at Leo's sleeping face, his flushed cheek pressed against his father's shoulder. A protective feeling, fierce and strong, surged within her. It was the instinct that had driven her to act earlier, the same instinct that had made her a good paramedic. But it was also the instinct that had burned her out. She shook her head slowly, the decision firming with a resigned sadness. "I'm sorry, truly, but the answer is no." She prepared to stand to end the conversation, and with it, this surreal chapter of her life. But at that exact moment, as if sensing her imminent departure, Leo stirred. He mumbled something in his sleep, his small fists clenching. Slowly, his eyes fluttered open, still hazy with sleep and the confusion of recent trauma. He didn't look at his father. His eyes, large and brown, scanned the room and landed on Lucia. Recognition flickered in them. And then he reached a small hand out toward her, a hesitant gesture full of a child's trust. "Lady," he whispered, his voice sleepy and fragile. "Stay." The single word, "stay," whispered in a child's sleepy voice, hit Lucia with more force than Arthur Montenegro's entire fortune. The offer of an executive salary, of a position with an impressive title, were abstract concepts, numbers in a bank account she could barely fathom. She had refused them because her heart, tired and wounded, had no more room for the kind of responsibility they represented. But Leo's request was different. It wasn't a business contract. It was a human plea in its purest, most disarming form. It was a small ship seeking its safe harbor after a storm. The boy didn't see an ex-paramedic or a cleaner. He saw the woman who had held him when he couldn't breathe, the calm voice that had soothed him when panic threatened to drown him. In his eyes, she wasn't a potential employee, she was a protector. Arthur watched the scene in reverent silence. He, the master negotiator, the man who built a billion-dollar empire on his ability to persuade, to find his opponent's weaknesses and offer exactly what they wanted, realized he had been using all the wrong tools. He had tried to buy gratitude with money, tried to frame an act of heroism in a corporate structure, and he had failed. His son, with a single word, had achieved what his entire net worth could not. He had reached Lucia's heart. For the first time that night, Arthur felt truly powerless, and strangely, that powerlessness wasn't frightening. It was a lesson in humility. He remained still, holding his son, understanding that this moment did not belong to him. It was a silent dialogue between the saved and the savior. Slowly, as if moved by an external force, Lucia approached the sofa. She knelt on the expensive rug, the same gesture she had made hours before when the crisis had struck. But this time, there was no panic, only an infinite tenderness. She reached out and took Leo's small, outstretched hand. The contact was electric, the boy's soft, warm skin against hers, which was calloused from years of hard work and care. It was a physical reminder of the life she had held in her hands. "You're okay now, little one," she whispered, her voice like velvet. Leo didn't reply, just squeezed her hand with what little strength he had, his eyes locked on hers. He didn't need words. The plea was all in his gaze. A silent battle raged inside Lucia. Her mind screamed at her to run from the responsibility, from the potential pain, from the bond that was already forming and which terrified her. She had promised herself a life of emotional passivity, a modest but stable personal cash flow, free of huge gains and, more importantly, devastating losses. Accepting Arthur's offer was the highest risk investment she could possibly make, not of capital, but of her own heart. But then she looked into Leo's eyes and saw the ghosts of her parents in their final days, the same vulnerability, the same need for trust and care. And she knew, with a certainty that ached, that she couldn't turn her back. Perhaps her purpose wasn't to run from the burden, but to learn how to carry it differently. She released Leo's hand gently and stood. Her eyes, clear and resolved, met Arthur's. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. The billionaire held his breath, sensing his family's destiny was being decided in that instant. "I will accept your offer, Mr. Montenegro," she said, her voice echoing with a quiet authority that filled the vast hall. A wave of pure, overwhelming relief washed over Arthur's face. He opened his mouth to thank her, to express his gratitude, but she held up a hand, silencing him. "But," she continued, her gaze firm and unwavering, "I have one condition, a non-negotiable condition." Arthur's mind, trained to anticipate market moves and calculate complex business outcomes, worked furiously to predict Lucia's condition. He was prepared for anything that could be quantified, a salary higher than he'd offered, a long-term contract with a multi-million-dollar buyout clause, perhaps seed capital for a business she wanted to start. He was ready to transfer stocks, to move sums that would make most people faint. His entire net worth was, in theory, on the table. All that mattered was ensuring she stayed. Leo's safety was now the only profit he pursued. He expected a number, a financial demand that, however high, would be simple to resolve. He expected a negotiation, but her condition, when it came, had nothing to do with money. It was something far more expensive. "I don't want your money, Mr. Montenegro," Lucia said, her voice calm but carrying an unshakable weight. "The salary you offered is more than fair, it's generous. My condition isn't about that." She held his gaze, and for the first time, Arthur felt as if he were being appraised by someone whose criteria he didn't understand. "My condition is about you." Arthur blinked, confused. "About me?" "Yes," she confirmed. "I saw what happened tonight. I don't blame you for your panic. The fear for a child is the most overwhelming force there is. But your panic made you a liability in the emergency, not an asset. You screamed, you accused, you fell apart. If I hadn't been here, your despair would have only worsened your son's terror in his final moments." The words were direct, brutal in their honesty, but there was no cruelty in them. It was the clinical assessment of a professional. "If I am going to take responsibility for Leo's safety," she continued, "I need a partner, not just a boss who signs the checks. I need the most important person in his life, his father, to be capable of action. My condition is this: you will take a full course in first aid and CPR. With me, you will learn to recognize the signs of choking, to perform the Heimlich maneuver, to handle a high fever, a seizure. You will learn to remain calm under the most extreme pressure a parent can face. The proposition was so unexpected, so radically different from anything he had imagined, that Arthur was momentarily speechless. Learn. Get his hands dirty. He, who paid fortunes for the world's top experts to solve his problems. But I can hire the best instructors in the world to, he started, but the logic of his old habits died on his lips under her steady gaze. No, Lucia said. The word final and unquestionable. You will learn with me, because I need to know that you've learned. I need to see in your eyes that if something happens when I'm not around, you will be Leo's salvation, not another victim of the panic. This is my condition, your presence, your time, your commitment. That is the only return on investment I'm interested in. The room fell silent. The grandeur of the mansion, the sparkle of the crystal, all of it faded away. What remained was the stark truth of her demand. She wasn't asking for his money. She was asking him to become the father Leo needed him to be. The humiliation Arthur felt was profound but purifying. She was right, completely right. He nodded slowly, the decision forming not in his negotiator's mind, but in his father's heart. I accept. Lucia nodded back, a flicker of approval in her eyes. Good, she said. Her transition from job applicant to instructor, immediate and total. Our first lesson is tomorrow, 7 a.m. sharp, and wear comfortable clothes. You're going to learn to save your son's life on the same marble floor where you almost lost him. The next morning dawned cold and grey, the leaden sky casting a pale light over the mansion's silent opulence. The ballroom, stripped of the previous night's chaos, felt vast and empty. The crystal glasses had been cleared, the flower arrangements removed, but the spot on the floor where Leo had nearly perished seemed, to Arthur, to be seared into the marble. At 7 a.m. sharp, he came down the stairs, not in the Italian linen suit that was his daily armor, but in sweatpants and a simple t-shirt as ordered. He felt like a stranger in his own home, an actor on a stage he no longer controlled. In the center of the ballroom, on the cold marble, lay a child-sized first aid training dummy, and next to it stood Lucia. She wasn't in a cleaner's uniform. She was dressed with the same functional simplicity as him, but her posture was different. She was the instructor, the authority. The calm on her face was that of a professional in her element. There was no deference, no intimidation. There was only purpose. "Good morning, Mr. Montenegro," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Let's begin." For the next hour, she walked him through the theory of airway obstruction with relentless precision. She used simple medical terms, explaining the mechanics of breathing, the anatomy of the throat, the physics behind the maneuver that had saved Leo's life. Arthur, the man who absorbed complex reports on capital markets and deciphered global business trends, struggled to focus. Every word she spoke, every diagram she drew in the air, was a knife twisting in the wound of his memory. He saw Leo's face, the panic in his eyes, the blue tint of his skin. The knowledge she was offering him was the weapon he hadn't possessed, and its absence the night before was the source of his deepest shame. Then, the theory ended. "Now, the practical," Lucia announced. "Kneel." The command was simple, but to Arthur, it felt as though she had asked him to step off a cliff. He hesitated, kneeling on that floor. Again, but he obeyed. His knees cracked as they met the cold stone. It was the same spot, the same position of his defeat. "Position the dummy as if it's choking," she instructed. Arthur did so, his hands trembling. "Now, wrap your arms around it, under the dummy's arms." He tried, but his movements were clumsy, weak. The image of Lucia holding Leo with swift, precise strength haunted him. He was useless. "Firmer," Lucia said, her voice cutting through his spiral of panic. "Your hesitation would cost him his life." He tried again, sweat beading on his forehead. He closed his eyes, but Leo's image was seared onto his eyelids. The terror paralyzed him. He couldn't do it. It was as if his muscles refused to obey, trapped in the same helplessness as the night before. "I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking. I keep seeing him. He trailed off, his throat tight with emotion. Lucia knelt beside him, her voice, for the first time, softened, losing its instructor's edge and gaining a caregiver's compassion. I know, she said, I know what you're seeing, but fear won't save him, Mr. Montenegro. Knowledge will open your eyes. He obeyed. Now look at your hands, she ordered gently. They are no longer the hands of a panicked father. They are the hands of a father who is learning to save his son. Feel the difference. Feel the power in that. Now try again. Guided by her voice, he got into position. He felt strength return to his arms. He applied the pressure inward and upward with a sudden, forceful thrust. There was a small pop as the simulated object was expelled from the dummy's mouth. The sound broke him. A sob escaped his lips, then another. The control he had maintained for his entire adult life shattered, and there, on the floor of his own mansion, the billionaire collapsed into tears, not of despair, but of a painful, profound release. Lucia said nothing. She simply placed a firm hand on his shoulder, a gesture of pure, silent support. The weeks that followed transformed the mansion. The oppressive silence of Arthur's anxiety was replaced by a new tranquility. The first aid lessons became a ritual, a routine that redefined their mornings. Lucia was a demanding and methodical teacher, and Arthur, a dedicated, humble student. He learned not just the techniques, but the philosophy behind them, the importance of calm, assessment, and deliberate action. With every maneuver practiced on the dummy, every emergency scenario they simulated, the traumatic memory of that night was slowly being overwritten by a sense of competence and control. He was no longer a terrified spectator in his own life. He was becoming an active guardian. The change in Arthur was profound. His business associates noted a new perspective in his decisions, a patience that hadn't existed before. He began to delegate more, to understand that his vast net worth wouldn't crumble if he didn't monitor every single transaction, every fluctuation of his stocks. He discovered that true wealth wasn't in quarterly dividends or the rising value of his funds, but in being able to sit on the floor and play with his son without the paralyzing fear that had once haunted him. Lucia, in turn, found a purpose that didn't drain her, but nourished her. Watching over Leo wasn't like the relentless chaos of the E&R. It was an act of building, of tending to a life so it could flourish. She organized the boy's diet and his activities, and she oversaw the hiring of a new nanny with a rigor that impressed Arthur. She became the home's center of gravity, a calm, steadying presence that benefited everyone. Slowly, the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble. She allowed herself to laugh at Leo's jokes, felt a pang of pride watching Arthur master a new bandaging technique, and in the quiet evenings, when the house was asleep, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since her parents were gone. One evening, long after Leo had been put to bed, Arthur found Lucia in the library, watching the rain beat against the windows. "I never really thanked you," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Not for what you did that night, but for everything you've done since, for your condition." Lucia turned to him, a slight smile on her lips. "You didn't have to. Watching you practice on the training dummy, even when you think no one is looking, is all the thanks I need." Arthur watched the rain for a moment before replying. "It changed everything. I spent my life analyzing my assets and liabilities, thinking I was in control, but I was wrong. My only true asset was playing on the rug, and I didn't know how to protect him. You taught me that the greatest investment a man can make is in his own ability to protect the ones he loves. You gave me peace of mind, the most valuable return of all. And you gave me a purpose when I thought mine was gone," she answered, the sincerity in her voice touching him deeply. Their relationship had evolved. She was no longer the cleaner or the employee. He was no longer the billionaire boss. They were partners, confidants, two souls who had found in each other something they didn't even know they were looking for. In the comfortable silence that followed, Arthur felt a new emotion blooming in his chest, something that went beyond gratitude and respect. It was a warm, quiet and profound feeling he hadn't felt since Helena was gone. He looked at her, not at the hero or the employee, but at the woman, Lucia, and for the first time allowed himself to imagine a future he never thought he'd have again. 6 months passed. The mansion, once a mausoleum of luxury and a stage for the display of wealth, had transformed into a home. The most common sound was no longer the distant murmur of deals over treasury bonds or the stock market, but the infectious laughter of Leo chasing through the gardens, with Arthur often in clumsy, happy pursuit. Lucia would watch them from the porch, a cup of tea in her hands, a serene smile on her face. She had found her place not as an employee, but as the heart of this small family. Her presence had become the axis around which Arthur's and Leo's lives now revolved. Arthur's gratitude, once intense and overwhelming, had matured. Over time, it had deepened into a profound respect for Lucia's intelligence, her calm, and her unshakable integrity. And that respect, quietly, without him even noticing at first, had bloomed into an unexpected and profound love. He hadn't fallen for the cleaner he'd accused, or even the hero who had saved his son. He had fallen for the woman who taught him how to be a father, who challenged him to be a better man, and who saw past his billion-dollar net worth to the vulnerable man underneath. That autumn afternoon, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and orange, Arthur approached her on the porch. Leo was inside, engrossed in a puzzle. "I was thinking about that night," he said, his voice quiet. "The night of the party." Lucia turned to him, expecting to see a shadow of the old pain in his eyes, but found only a reflective peace. "I used to think of it as the worst moment of my life," he continued, looking out at the horizon. "The night I almost lost everything. But I was wrong. It was the night I gained everything that truly matters." He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "I built an empire, Lucia, a castle of business, of assets and capital, meant to last for generations, but it was a cold, empty castle. The real legacy I want to leave for Leo isn't a fortune in dollars or gold. It's the example of a life built on real values. Courage, kindness, love, values you taught me to see again." He took a step forward, closing the space between them. "My job offer was the best deal I ever made. But now, I'd like to propose a new partnership, one that doesn't involve contracts or salaries, a partnership for life." Lucia's heart beat faster. She, who had sought a life free of emotional risk, now stood before the most important gamble of all. But looking at Arthur, she didn't feel fear. She felt home. "I don't know anything about your world, about the stock market or cryptocurrencies," she whispered. "You don't have to," he replied, taking her hand with a gentleness that belied his power in the business world. "You just have to know that my greatest asset, the net worth of my heart, is yours, if you'll have it." The tears that welled in Lucia's eyes were not of sorrow, but of a pure, overwhelming joy. "Yes," she said, "I accept." He drew her into an embrace, and in that moment, under the burning sky, the transformation was complete. The father who once knelt in despair now stood as a whole man. The scene that had made him fall apart was not the prelude to loss, but the beginning of a new life, built on the solid foundation of courage, competence, and love.